The cool, smooth glass of the vase felt like a block of ice against Eleanor's palms. She centered it on the mahogany table in the grand foyer, the polished wood reflecting its shape in a dark, distorted mirror. Her own reflection was there too, a pale, wavering ghost in the deep red grain. She carefully began arranging the flowers, one stem at a time. They were white lilies, their large, pristine petals unfurling in the still air of Blackwood Manor. Their fragrance, heavy and sweet, was a quiet rebellion against the house's perpetual scent of old beeswax and cold stone. For a moment, placing the first perfect bloom, a familiar, foolish hope flickered within her. Maybe today would be different. Maybe this small act of beauty would change the current, would bring a whisper of warmth into these cavernous rooms. The foyer was a vast, echoing chamber designed to intimidate. Sunlight struggled through the tall, leaded glass windows, landing in weak, hazy patches on the black and white marble floor. Every sound, from the whisper of her own silk blouse to the distant, muffled clang of a pot in the kitchens, bounced off the high, vaulted ceiling and returned, amplified and lonely. Dark wood panels lined the walls, interrupted every few feet by portraits of the Croft ancestors. Men and women with severe faces and cold, assessing eyes stared down from their gilded frames. Eleanor had long felt that they were not just paintings, but silent, permanent judges. She often found herself averting her gaze, as if they could see right through her carefully constructed composure and into the frightened girl still hiding inside. She could feel their collective disapproval, a silent chorus echoing Margaret Croft's frequent pronouncements about bloodlines and legacy. The Croft family crest, an imperious lion entwined with a hawk, was carved into the newel post of the grand staircase, stamped onto the very air she breathed. It was a constant reminder of the world she had married into, a world of immense wealth and unyielding tradition where she was merely a temporary, conditional guest. She had been a Vance, a name with its own quiet history, but one that had lost its fortune generations ago. The marriage was an arrangement, a transaction of stark and simple terms. Her respectable, if faded lineage for Julian's family's formidable power and influence. Her father had called it a sensible union, a way to secure the future. Margaret had called it a merging of two good names, though her tone suggested one name was doing all the heavy lifting. Eleanor had told herself it was a practical choice. She had entered Blackwood Manor 2 years ago with a secret, naive hope that behind the contract, she might find something more, a partnership, perhaps with time, even affection. She looked at Julian's handsome, serious face on their wedding day and allowed herself to dream of a life where they might build a genuine connection, a private world away from the cold expectations of his family. That dream had died a slow and silent death, starved of warmth and light in the chilling perfection of this house. Now, all that remained was the performance of being Mrs. Julian Croft, a role she played from morning until night. A sharp, rhythmic clicking sound began to echo from the long hall. Eleanor's shoulders tensed instantly. She knew that sound better than her own heartbeat. It was the sound of Margaret's Italian leather heels striking the marble floor with methodical precision. It was the sound of an impending inspection, a judgment about to be rendered. Eleanor did not look up. She kept her focus on the lilies, her fingers gently coaxing a stubborn petal to open. She tried to slow her breathing, to project an air of calm, leisurely activity, a pleasant wife brightening her home. That was the role for this scene. Margaret did not stop beside her, but her pace slowed as she drew level with the table. Eleanor could feel her mother-in-law's presence, a tangible drop in the temperature of the air. She could smell Margaret's perfume, a dry, floral scent that always seemed to carry a note of disapproval. For a long moment, there was only the sound of Eleanor's soft breathing and the faint, almost imperceptible rustle of Margaret's dress. Then the voice came, smooth as chilled honey. Lilies. Eleanor finally looked up, arranging a polite, neutral smile on her face. Good morning, Margaret. I thought they might add a bit of life to the foyer. Margaret's eyes, a pale and piercing blue, did not look at Eleanor. They were fixed on the flowers. A thin, perfectly painted brow arched a fraction of an inch. How very straightforward, she said, her voice lilting with a faint musical cruelty. She took another step, her gaze sweeping over the arrangement as if assessing a tradesman's clumsy work. One sees them so often. At funerals, the words landed like tiny sharp stones, straightforward, common, morbid. Each adjective, though unspoken, hung in the air between them. The flicker of hope Eleanor had felt just moments before was extinguished, replaced by a familiar, hot wave of shame. She suddenly saw the lilies through Margaret's eyes. They were no longer symbols of life and beauty, but clumsy, obvious gestures. A desperate attempt by an ordinary woman to mimic an elegance she could never truly possess. Her choice was, like her, terribly common. "I find them classic," Eleanor replied, her voice quieter than she intended. It was a weak defense, and she knew it. Margaret gave a small, airy laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, dear. Classic." She finally turned her gaze to Eleanor, a faint, pitying smile playing on her lips. "You must try not to tire yourself with these domestic projects. We have staff for such things." With a final dismissive glance at the white blooms, Margaret continued her unhurried journey toward the West Wing, her footsteps once again clicking out their sharp, imperious rhythm on the marble. The sound faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand still hovering over a lily. The sweet scent of the flowers now seemed cloying, funereal. Margaret had not raised her voice. She had not been overtly unkind, but the message was delivered with surgical precision. "You do not belong. Your taste is unsophisticated. Your efforts are pointless." It was the same message Eleanor received every day, in 100 different ways. A casual remark about her dress, a subtle correction of her grammar at the dinner table, an invitation to a family event that was forgotten until the last possible minute. It was a slow, steady erosion of her spirit, a campaign waged with smiles and soft words that cut deeper than any shout. She lowered her hand, her fingers tracing the cold edge of the mahogany table. She had tried so hard. In the beginning, she had studied the family's history, read the books on art and finance she thought would please Julian, and mimic the reserved, polished manners of the women in Margaret's social circle. She had tried to become a Croft, but it was like trying to change the color of her own eyes. Every attempt she made to fit in only seemed to highlight how much she stood out. Her natural warmth was seen as a lack of discipline. Her desire for conversation was interpreted as a sign of anxiety. Her very essence, the person she was before she walked through these doors, was deemed unsuitable. The heavy oak front door swung open, breaking the stillness. A gust of cool autumn air swept into the foyer, carrying the scent of damp earth and rain. Julian strode in, tall and formidable in a dark gray suit that seemed tailored from shadows and steel. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his handsome face was set in his usual expression of detached authority. He looked like he had been carved from the same cold stone as the manor itself. His cold blue eyes, so like his mother's, swept the foyer but did not linger on anything. Not on the flowers and not on her. "Eleanor," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a simple acknowledgement of her presence, like noting a chair or a lamp. He placed his leather briefcase on the floor with a soft thud. "Julian," she replied, her voice still small. "Welcome home." She waited, a knot of familiar tension tightening in her stomach. She hoped he might notice the flowers. He appreciated efficiency and order, but perhaps a beautiful, well-ordered arrangement might catch his eye. Perhaps he might offer a single word of approval, a crumb of validation she could cling to for the rest of the day. He did not. He loosened his tie with one swift, impatient motion. "Did the quarterly reports from Sterling arrive?" he asked, his gaze already moving past her, toward the hallway that led to his study. "I need them on my desk before the call with Tokyo." The question was so abrupt, so devoid of any personal connection, that it felt like a physical blow. She was not his wife, standing here after a long and lonely day. She was his assistant, his household manager, a functional part of the well-oiled machine that was his life. The space that should have been filled with a "how was your day?" or even a simple shared silence was instead filled with business. Always business. "Yes, Julian," she said, the words feeling like dust in her mouth. "They came this afternoon. They were in your study, on the left side of your desk." "Good, Ozithal," he said, already turning away. He took 2 long strides down the hall before pausing, though he did not turn back to look at her. Margaret mentioned we are hosting the Barclays for dinner on Saturday. See to the arrangements. It was not a request. It was an order. And then he was gone, his polished shoes making no sound on the thick runner that carpeted the corridor. The heavy silence of the foyer descended once more. Eleanor was left standing alone. The grand space felt impossibly large, and she felt infinitesimally small within it. Julian's brief, sterile presence had been even more isolating than Margaret's calculated cruelty. Margaret at least saw her enough to find her wanting. To Julian, she was barely there at all. She was just another item on a long list of duties, a quiet, simple arrangement that was supposed to run smoothly and without complication. Her gaze fell back to the table, to the vase of white lilies. They stood there in their perfect, silent beauty, a testament to her failed attempt to create a moment of warmth. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. Straightforward. Funerals. The heavy, sweet scent filled her lungs, and for the first time it did not smell like life. It smelled like endings. It smelled like a room where something precious had been laid to rest. The flowers were no longer a symbol of hope. They were a symbol of her own inadequacy, a beautiful, fragrant monument to her own irrelevance in the cold, grand house she was supposed to call home. The dress was the color of a winter sky just before a storm. Ice blue silk fell in a straight, unforgiving line from her shoulders to the floor, cold against her skin. A delicate constellation of tiny diamonds was scattered across the bodice, catching the light with a sterile fire. It was beautiful. It was also a cage. Margaret Croft had laid it out on the bed herself, the tissue paper rustling with a sound like dry leaves. "This will do perfectly, Eleanor," she had said, her voice smooth and final. "It has elegance without being loud. Subtlety is always key." Eleanor had stared at the dress, her own reflection looking back at her from the polished surface of the wardrobe. The woman in the reflection looked pale, her soft brown hair seeming drab against the shimmering fabric. Subtlety. Was that what Margaret called it? Eleanor knew it was a different word. Invisible. The dress was designed not to enhance her, but to make her blend into the opulent background of Blackwood Manor. It was another uniform, just like the polite, empty smile she was expected to wear. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, a silent protest that never found its voice. She had hoped, when Julian proposed, that she would be his partner. She was quickly learning she was just another one of the family's pristine, well-managed assets. An hour later, she descended the grand staircase. Each step on the cold marble echoed in the cavernous hall. Julian was waiting at the bottom, a striking figure in his tailored tuxedo. He looked like he was carved from the same expensive stone as the manor itself. He glanced up, his cold blue eyes doing a quick, dismissive sweep. It was not the look of a husband admiring his wife. It was the look of an executive inspecting a product before a launch. "You're ready," he stated. It was not a question. He offered his arm, and she placed her hand on his sleeve. His touch was firm, impersonal, a necessary gesture for the performance ahead. The Croft family crest, a severe lion and a hawk, was embossed on his cufflinks. It seemed to watch her with predatory stillness. The charity gala was a sea of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto the swirling crowd, the air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful conversations. A string quartet played in a corner, their music a sophisticated, melodic wallpaper that no one seemed to truly hear. Eleanor held a champagne flute, the glass cold and slick in her hand. She hadn't taken a single sip. Her stomach was a tight knot of anxiety. Julian had left her side the moment they entered, absorbed into a circle of men with serious faces and booming laughs. She was adrift, a small, solitary boat in a vast, indifferent ocean. She tried to anchor herself. She focused on the paintings, the floral arrangements, the pattern of the parquet floor. Anything to avoid meeting the fleeting, curious glances that slid over her and then moved on, finding nothing of interest. She was Mrs. Croft, a name that carried immense weight, yet she herself felt weightless, transparent. She smoothed down the silk of her dress, the gesture doing nothing to soothe her. She was a ghost, haunting her own life. After what felt like an eternity of standing alone, A man with kind eyes and a slightly rumpled suit approached her. He looked out of place too, and perhaps that's why he sought her out. "Mrs. Croft?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm Alistair Finch. I read about your involvement with the city's community garden initiative. It's a wonderful project." A genuine warmth spread through Eleanor's chordum. It was a startling, unfamiliar feeling. Someone was speaking to her, not to the name she carried, but to her. She had poured hours into that project before her marriage, finding solace in the soil and the simple act of helping things grow. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, her smile feeling real for the first time all evening. "I believe green spaces are vital for a community's well-being." They spoke for a few minutes about native plants and the challenges of urban gardening. For a brief, shining moment, Eleanor forgot where she was. She was not a decorative object. She was a person with thoughts, with passions. The knot in her stomach began to loosen. She felt a flicker of the woman she used to be, the woman who laughed easily and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Mr. Finch was listening intently, his expression open and engaged. He saw her. He actually saw her. Then a shadow fell over them. "Alistair, darling." Margaret's voice was like chilled honey. She glided to a stop beside them, her own gown a severe, regal column of dark emerald. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "How lovely to see you. I was just telling the ambassador you were here." She placed a hand on Mr. Finch's arm, a proprietary gesture that immediately broke the connection he had with Eleanor. Mr. Finch's smile faltered. He looked from Margaret to Eleanor, his kind eyes now filled with a flicker of social panic. He understood the dynamics instantly. "Eleanor was just keeping you occupied, I'm sure," Margaret continued, her tone light but the implication as sharp as glass. "She's so good at making sure our guests feel welcome before they move on to more important conversations." The insult was breathtaking in its casual cruelty. She had reduced Eleanor's genuine conversation to a mere holding pattern, the work of a hired greeter. A void opened up around Eleanor. The warmth from her brief talk with Mr. Finch evaporated, leaving a familiar, biting chill. "The ambassador is waiting," Margaret said, her grip tightening on Alistair's arm, already steering him away. He gave Eleanor a final, apologetic glance over his shoulder before he was swallowed by the crowd, Margaret's triumphant laughter echoing faintly behind him. Eleanor stood frozen, the champagne flute trembling in her hand. The bubbles rose and died. The noise of the party seemed to recede, replaced by a roaring in her ears. She was alone again, but this time it was worse. She had been given a glimpse of connection, only to have it snatched away and crushed in front of her. Margaret had not just interrupted them. She had deliberately and expertly erased her. She had reinforced Eleanor's status as a nobody, a silent accessory to the Croft name. She looked around the room. No one had noticed. No one cared. The magnificent party continued its orbit, and she was not even a speck of dust in its glittering galaxy. A wave of desperate loneliness washed over her. She scanned the room for Julian. She needed something, anything, a reassuring glance, a moment of solidarity. She spotted him near the French doors, deep in conversation with a man whose face was on the cover of a financial magazine last month. She walked towards him, her steps feeling heavy, as if she were wading through water. She waited politely for a pause in their conversation. When the other man turned to greet someone else, she touched Julian's arm lightly. "Julian," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to her, his expression impatient. "What is it, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice low and clipped. His eyes darted around the room, already looking for his next important contact. She didn't know what to say. "I feel invisible. Your mother just humiliated me. I want to go home." All the words felt childish and weak. They would not fit in this world of polished surfaces and unspoken power plays. "I was just wondering if we might talk for a moment." A flash of irritation crossed his face. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. His voice was a cold, sharp blade. "Eleanor, there are photographers from 3 major publications here tonight. Your job is simple. Focus on smiling and looking pleasant. That is your contribution. Do not create complications." He didn't wait for a reply. He straightened his tie, gave her a curt, dismissive nod, turned back to his conversation as if she had never been there. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Smile and look pleasant. Your contribution. It was not just a dismissal, it was a definition. Her entire purpose, her entire being in his world, was reduced to a pretty picture. He was no different from his mother. In fact, he was worse. Margaret's cruelty was a sport, but Julian's was a simple, cold fact. She was a line item in the budget of his life, and her only function was to be aesthetically pleasing and silent. The hope she had secretly nurtured, the tiny, foolish ember that believed he might one day see her, was finally extinguished. All that was left was cold, dark ash. She couldn't breathe. The air, so thick with perfume, was suffocating. The music was a painful, screeching noise. The laughter of the crowd felt like a mockery. She had to get out. Turning abruptly, she walked away from Julian, away from the glittering, heartless room. She didn't know where she was going. She just moved, her ice blue dress rustling around her ankles. She pushed open a heavy set of glass doors and stumbled out onto a deserted stone balcony. The cool night air was a shock, but a welcome one. It cut through the cloying heat of the party. Below her, the manicured gardens of the estate were bathed in moonlight, silent and serene. The noise from the gala was muffled out here, a distant, meaningless thrum. She gripped the cold, damp stone of the balustrade, her knuckles white. Her whole body was shaking. She leaned over, gasping for air, trying to push down the chill that was clawing its way up her throat. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down her cold cheek. Then another. She didn't wipe them away. What was the point? There was no one here to see. She was just an ornament, and ornaments do not cry. They just hang there, silent and beautiful, until they are eventually taken down and put away. She stared out into the darkness, the sound of the party a cruel reminder of the world she was in, but not of. The laughter from inside was a language she no longer understood. The heavy bedroom door clicked shut behind her, the sound swallowed by the thick carpets and towering ceilings. Silence descended, profound and absolute. It was a different kind of quiet from the deserted balcony. Out there, the distant murmur of the party had been a constant reminder of her exclusion. Here, the silence was a vacuum, pressing in on her from all sides. It was the sound of Blackwood Manor itself, a place so vast and immaculately kept that it seemed to absorb all life. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the room, the emerald silk of Margaret's chosen dress rustling against her skin. It felt like a stranger's costume. In the enormous gilt mirror across the room, she saw a woman she barely recognized. A figure framed by carved mahogany and damask wallpaper, adorned with jewels that caught the soft lamplight with a cold, impersonal fire. The Croft diamonds. They felt heavy around her neck, not like a gift, but like a collar. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless. She was a portrait of elegance, a carefully constructed illusion. But her eyes, even from this distance, were hollow. They were the only part of her that told the truth. Slowly, she raised her hands and her fingers fumbled with the clasp of the necklace. It was intricate and stubborn. For a moment, she felt a frantic urge to rip it from her throat. Instead, she took a steadying breath, her knuckles white, and worked the mechanism until it finally sprang open. The necklace fell into her palm, a cold, heavy puddle of silver and stone. She walked over to the velvet-lined jewelry box on her dressing table, a cavern of glittering assets. She dropped the necklace inside without a second glance. The earrings followed, then the bracelet. Each piece she removed felt like a layer of armor being shed, leaving her more exposed, but also more herself. Finally, she unzipped the dress. The silk slithered to the floor around her feet, a shimmering green pool on the antique rug. She stepped out of it and left it there, a shed skin. She pulled on a simple cotton robe, the soft, worn fabric a comfort against her chilled skin. The room smelled of expensive perfume and beeswax, a sterile, unwelcoming scent. It was the smell of a life that was not her own. Her gaze swept over the room. It was magnificent by any standard. The four-poster bed was a fortress of dark wood, draped in fabrics so fine they seemed to float. The furniture was all antique, each piece a museum-quality specimen with a silent, imposing history. Even the air felt curated, still and cool, but there was no warmth here, no clutter of a life lived, No stack of half-read books by the bed, no favorite mug left on a nightstand, no framed photographs of friends or family. Margaret had decreed that personal effects were untidy. The only art on the walls were somber landscapes from centuries past, chosen for their investment value. It was a showroom, not a sanctuary. It was Julian's space. She was merely a guest in it. Eleanor walked to the tall, mullioned window and looked out. The manicured grounds of Blackwood Manor stretched into the darkness, a perfect, orderly world under a sliver of moon. Down below, the last of the cars were pulling away from the gala, their headlights sweeping across the gravel drive. Another performance was over. Another evening of smiling until her jaw ached, of feeling invisible in a crowded room, of being Julian's silent, beautiful accessory. He had told her to focus on looking pleasant. He hadn't said a word to her since. He would likely come to bed in an hour or two, slipping under the covers without a sound, his back a rigid wall between them. The distance between the two sides of the bed felt wider than any ocean. A deep, familiar ache settled in her chest. It was a loneliness so profound, it felt like a physical presence in the room with her. This was not the simple solitude she had sometimes enjoyed in her old life, the quiet comfort of being alone with her own thoughts. This was a hollowing out, a feeling of being utterly disconnected from everything and everyone. She needed an anchor. She needed a reminder that the woman in the mirror was not the real her. Her steps were quiet as she crossed the room to a large, ornate chest of drawers. It was filled with Julian's perfectly folded sweaters and shirts, each smelling faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. She ignored the top drawers. Her hand went to the very bottom one, the one he never used. She pulled it open. Tucked away at the back, beneath a soft cashmere scarf she had brought from home, was a small, plain, wooden box. It was the only thing in this entire room that was truly hers. She lifted it out, her fingers tracing the simple grain of the wood. It had been her grandmother's. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was a silver locket. It was small and oval, worn smooth over the years, with no engravings or embellishments. It was so simple, so modest, that it would have been an object of scorn to Margaret. To Eleanor, it was the most precious thing she owned. She lifted the delicate chain, and the cool metal felt like a shock of reality against her skin. She closed her hand around the locket, holding it tight as if drawing strength from it. It was a ritual she performed on her worst nights, a silent act of rebellion in this gilded cage. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress barely dipping under her weight. With a gentle pressure from her thumb, the locket clicked open. Inside, on one side, was a tiny faded photograph of her mother, Helen. She was younger in the picture, standing in her garden with the sun in her hair, a wide, genuine smile on her face. It was a smile that reached her eyes, crinkling them at the corners, a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. Eleanor's breath hitched. She could almost smell the damp earth and the roses from that garden. She could almost feel the warmth of that sun. Her thumb stroked the tiny image, a gesture she had made 1,000 times. The paper was worn nearly through from her touch. This tiny picture was her lifeline. It was a reminder of a world where love was not a transaction, where worth was not measured by status or appearance. It was a world of warm kitchens, mismatched mugs, and laughter that was loud and real. A world she had traded for this cold, silent grandeur. She had told herself it was the right thing to do, a way to provide security for her family after her father's business had struggled. She had convinced herself that respect, and perhaps even affection, could grow in time. She had been so naive. A single tear escaped and traced a slow, cold path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. What would her mother think if she could see her now? Not the poised woman at the gala, but this one, sitting alone in a cavernous bedroom, clutching a locket like a frightened child. Her mother, who had always told her that her happiness was the only thing that mattered. A wave of desperate longing washed over her. She needed to hear her voice, not just remember it, but hear it. Now, her hand trembled as she reached for the sleek, minimalist phone on the nightstand. It felt alien in her hand, another piece of the cold Croft world. She scrolled through the contacts, past the long list of names that began with Croft, past business associates and society contacts she barely knew. Her finger hovered over the one entry that felt like home. Mom. She pressed the call button before she could lose her nerve. The phone began to ring. the electronic tones sounding harsh and intrusive in the quiet room. One ring. Two. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Maybe she shouldn't have called. It was late. What would she even say? Three rings. She was about to hang up when the ringing stopped. Eleanor? Darling, is that you? Is everything all right? The voice was just as she remembered, warm, gentle, and instantly laced with concern. It was like a warm blanket wrapping around her. A sob built in Eleanor's throat, and she had to swallow it down, hard. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing a brightness into her own voice that she did not feel. Hi, Mom. Yes, of course. I'm sorry. Is it too late? I was thinking of you. The lie came easily. It was one she had practiced for 2 years. There was a soft chuckle on the other end of the line. It's never too late for you, my love. I was just finishing a book. Did you have a nice evening? Was it another one of those fancy parties? Eleanor could picture her perfectly. Curled up in her favorite worn armchair, a quilt over her lap, a cup of chamomile tea steaming on the table beside her. The image was so clear, so painfully dear, that it made her own opulent surroundings feel even more like a prison. It was, Eleanor said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into her tone. It was a charity gala for the Children's Hospital. Very grand. Margaret was in her element, of course. She tried to make it sound like a light-hearted joke. Oh, I'm sure she was, Helen said, and Eleanor could hear the careful neutrality in her mother's voice. Helen never spoke ill of the Crofts, but Eleanor knew she saw right through their polished facade. And you, darling, did you have a good time? Oh yes, the music was lovely, and the food was incredible. She described the string quartet, the ice sculptures, the parade of designer gowns. She talked about everything except how she had felt. She painted a picture of a glittering fairy tale evening, hoping the bright colors would hide the gray truth underneath. She talked to fill the space, to keep her mother's gentle, probing questions at bay. It all sounds very impressive, Helen said slowly. There was a pause, and in that silence, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed cheerfulness begin to fray. She knew that pause. It was the pause her mother used when she was listening not to the words but to the feelings behind them. How is the garden? Eleanor asked quickly, changing the subject. Are the hydrangeas blooming yet? They're beautiful this year, big as dinner plates, and the most wonderful shade of blue. You always loved the blue ones. Another gentle reminder of a life that was hers. And Thomas, that naughty cat from next door, has decided my petunias make a very comfortable bed. Eleanor laughed, a small, genuine sound that surprised her. Of course he has. Give him a scratch behind the ears for me. For a few precious moments, they talked of simple things. The leaky faucet, a new recipe Helen had tried, the plot of the book she was reading. It was normal. It was real. With every word, Eleanor felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just a little. This was the world she belonged to. You should come visit soon, Ellie, Helen said, her voice soft again. The cottage feels too quiet without you. We could spend a whole afternoon just baking. Like we used to. Like we used to. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken loss. Before the contracts were signed, before the loveless vows, before Blackwood Manor. The knot in Eleanor's chest tightened again, fiercer this time. She wanted to. She wanted to run out of this house and not stop until she was on her mother's doorstep, wrapped in her arms. I'd love that, Mom. I'll check the calendar. Julian's schedule is just so demanding right now. The excuse sounded weak even to her own ears. Julian's schedule had nothing to do with it. The cage had its own rules. Unannounced visits were frowned upon. They disrupted the order of the household. Another pause, longer this time. Eleanor held her breath. She could feel the question coming, the one she had been dreading since the moment she dialed. Eleanor, Helen began, and her voice was stripped of all casualness now. It was the voice of a mother who knows her child is hurting. You sound tired, more than just late-night tired. It was a long evening, Eleanor deflected, her voice thin. All that smiling, it's exhausting. Is that all it is? Helen pressed gently. Darling, listen to me. I hear what you're saying. I hear about the dresses and the parties, but I don't hear you. I don't hear my happy girl. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. Her knuckles were white. "I am happy, Mom," she whispered, but the words felt like dust in her mouth, a lie so fragile it shattered as soon as it was spoken. "Are you?" The question was so soft, so full of love and pain. It was not an accusation. It was a plea, a key turning in a lock she had tried so hard to keep shut. "Eleanor, tell me the truth. Are you truly happy, darling?" The dam broke. A strangled sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped her lips. She pressed her free hand to her mouth, trying to stifle it, but it was too late. The sound was small, but in the vast silence of the room it felt like a scream. The carefully constructed wall of composure she had built around her heart for 2 years crumbled into dust. Tears she had held back on the balcony, in the car, and in this very room began to fall, hot and fast. They streamed down her face, dripping onto the pristine cotton of her robe. She couldn't speak. If she opened her mouth, a torrent of grief and loneliness and despair would pour out, a flood that would terrify her mother and shame herself. She couldn't lie, but the truth was too terrible to voice. "Oh, honey." Helen's voice came through the phone, thick with alarm and sorrow. She knew. Of course she knew. I, I have to go," Eleanor finally choked out, her voice cracking, unrecognizable. "It's just, I'm very tired. I'll call you tomorrow." "Eleanor, wait." But she couldn't wait. She couldn't bear another second of that loving, worried voice. It was too much of a contrast to the cold reality of her life. With a shaking finger, she ended the call. The click was unnervingly final. She dropped the phone onto the bed as if it had burned her. The warmth from her mother's voice vanished instantly, sucked away by the cold, still air of the room. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before, filled with the things she had left unsaid. She imagined her mother hundreds of miles away, staring at her own phone, her face etched with a worry that Eleanor herself had placed there. She had reached for a lifeline, and in doing so had only managed to pull her mother into her sea of misery. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth on the edge of the enormous, empty bed. The simple silver locket was still clutched in her hand, but it no longer felt like a comfort. It was just a cold piece of metal. She was more alone than ever. The silence after the phone call was a physical weight. Eleanor sat on the edge of her silk-covered bed, the receiver cold in her hand long after she had placed it back in its cradle. Her mother's worried voice echoed in her mind, a warm, distant melody from a life she no longer lived. Here, in the heart of Blackwood Manor, there was no melody. There was only the low hum of oppressive quiet and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, counting out the seconds of her gilded sentence. She felt a familiar hollowness spread through her chest, a void that no amount of lavish drapery or polished silver could ever fill. She had promised to visit soon, a desperate, flimsy bridge thrown across a widening chasm. But the truth was, she wasn't sure she knew the way back. A soft, almost apologetic knock came at her door. It was one of the younger housemaids, a girl named Sarah with wide, nervous eyes. She curtsied, a gesture that always made Eleanor feel deeply uncomfortable. The girl kept her gaze fixed on the Persian rug. She spoke in a hushed tone, as if afraid the walls themselves might disapprove. "Mrs. Croft requests your presence in the study, madam." At once, the words were simple, but they landed like stones. The study. In 2 years of living in this house, Eleanor had been inside that room only twice. It was Julian's father's old domain, now firmly Margaret's seat of power. It was not a place for casual conversation. It was a place for edicts and pronouncements. A cold dread trickled down Eleanor's spine. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, Sarah." The maid vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving Eleanor alone with the summons. She stood and smoothed down the front of her simple wool dress, a nervous, automatic gesture. Her hands were cold. She walked to the window and looked out over the manicured lawns, stretching out like a perfect, lifeless green sea towards the distant woods. The view was beautiful, flawless, and completely sterile. It offered no comfort. It only reminded her of the perfection she was expected to maintain, a standard she felt she was failing every single day. The walk to the study was a silent torment. Each step on the cold marble floor echoed through the cavernous hall, announcing her reluctant approach. The portraits of Croft ancestors watched her pass, their painted eyes seeming to follow her with stern, judgmental gazes. There was Julian's grandfather, a man with a severe jaw and eyes as cold as his grandson's. There was his great aunt, a woman whose lips were permanently pursed in disapproval. They were a dynasty of stone-faced conquerors, and she was an outsider, a common wildflower mistakenly planted in their cold, cultivated garden. She clutched the simple silver locket hidden beneath her dress, its smooth, cool surface a small, secret comfort against her skin. Inside it was her mother's smile, a universe away from this gallery of ghosts. She paused before the heavy oak door of the study. The wood was dark, almost black, and polished to a mirror sheen. The faint scent of leather and old paper seeped from beneath it, the smell of power and history she was not a part of. She took a deep breath, trying to steady the frantic beat of her heart. She felt like a schoolgirl called to the headmistress's office, a feeling of childish fear she resented. She was a grown woman, a wife. But in this house she was perpetually a child, perpetually on trial. She raised her hand and knocked. The sound was swallowed by the heavy wood. "Come in." Margaret's voice was crisp, cutting through the door with chilling clarity. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was even more imposing than she remembered. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were filled with thousands of leather-bound books, their gold-leaf titles glinting in the dim light from a single desk lamp. They were a library of knowledge, a testament to generations of education and influence, and Margaret had once told her they were not to be touched. They were for display, not for reading. A fire crackled quietly in the enormous stone fireplace, but it gave off little warmth. The air was cool and still. Margaret Croft sat behind a massive mahogany desk that looked more like an altar of corporate power than a piece of furniture. She was not looking at Eleanor. She was signing a letter with a heavy gold-nibbed fountain pen, the scratch of it the only sound besides the fire. The Croft family crest was embossed on the paper before her, the lion and the hawk, symbols of strength and predatory vision. Margaret finished her signature with a flourish, blotted the ink with practiced precision, and finally slowly lifted her eyes. Her gaze was not angry, it was worse. It was dissecting, like a biologist studying an uninteresting specimen. "Close the door, Eleanor." Her voice was quiet, yet it commanded the entire room. Eleanor did as she was told, the click of the latch sounding unnervingly final. She stood before the desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very air was pressing in on her. Margaret leaned back in her high-back leather chair, tapping the fountain pen against the polished surface of the desk. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap was the only sound for a long, agonizing moment. "Do you know why I have asked you here?" Margaret asked, her voice dangerously smooth. Eleanor's mind raced. Was it the flowers? Her conversation at the gala? Her phone call to her mother? Every small act of selfhood felt like a potential crime. "I am not sure, Margaret." Margaret let out a small, dry sigh, a sound of profound disappointment. "That in itself is part of the problem. You are not sure. You drift through this house, through this family, as if you are merely a guest, a visitor who has overstayed her welcome." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This is not a hotel, Eleanor. This is a legacy, and you have a duty to it." Duty, the word hung in the air, cold and heavy. Eleanor's throat felt tight. "I try my best." "Your best?" Margaret's laugh was a short, sharp sound without a trace of humor. "My dear girl, your best is falling desperately short." She gestured vaguely toward the room. "Look around you. This house, our name, it represents something. It represents stability, strength, and unwavering standards. It is a brand, a fortress. And the wife of Julian Croft is one of its primary representatives. Her role is to embody that strength, to be polished, poised, and impeccable, a reflection of the family's own perfection." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "And what do we have instead? We have a woman who chooses common flowers for the foyer, a woman who hides on balconies during important social events, a woman who, I am told, spends her time making melancholy phone calls when she should be managing the household staff or attending to her social obligations." Margaret's voice was low, each word a carefully aimed dart. "We have a disappointment." The word struck Eleanor with physical force. Disappointment. It was the word she had feared her entire life, and to hear it spoken so coldly, so clinically, stole the breath from her lungs. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. She fought them back, refusing to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her cry. I, I did not know I was failing so badly, she managed to say, her voice trembling slightly. That is because you do not think, Margaret snapped, the politeness finally cracking. You wander around with this air of wounded sensitivity. You think this marriage is about your personal happiness. Let me be perfectly clear, as it seems Julian has been too gentle with you. This marriage is an arrangement, a merger, your respectable but financially faded name for our influence and resources. It was a transaction designed to be mutually beneficial. Your duty is to uphold your end of the bargain. Eleanor's hands were shaking now. She clenched them into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. The pain was a small, sharp anchor in a swirling sea of humiliation. She had always known, on some level, that this was the truth, but she had held on to a foolish, secret hope that genuine affection might grow, that she might, in time, earn her place not as an asset but as a person, as family. To hear the cold mechanics of it laid bare was like having her chest ripped open. Margaret stood up and walked around the desk, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. She stopped directly in front of Eleanor, so close that Eleanor could smell the faint, expensive scent of her perfume. It smelled like lilies, the funereal kind. The Croft name is not a toy, Eleanor. It is not something you are given to play with until you grow bored. It is a responsibility, one that you are proving incapable of handling. Your purpose here is to be an asset to Julian, to be a credit to him in public and a serene presence in his home. Not a source of atmospheric gloom, not a problem to be managed. Eleanor found a sliver of courage, a spark of defiance from the woman she used to be. And what if I cannot be that person? What if I cannot be a serene presence? Margaret's lips curved into a thin, cruel smile. Then you are of no use to us. She looked Eleanor up and down, her gaze lingering with disdain. Do not make the mistake of thinking your position here is permanent. It is not. It is conditional. It is conditional upon your performance, your compliance, and your ability to understand and accept your role. Arrangements can be amended. Positions can be revoked. Revoked. The word was so sterile, so corporate, like a canceled credit card, like a rescinded membership. It was a threat, naked and absolute. All the pretense of family, of marriage, of a shared life was stripped away in that single word. She was an employee on probation, and she had just received her first official warning. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the anger and humiliation. The world outside these stone walls was one she no longer knew. Her family had been saved from financial ruin by this marriage. Leaving was not just a matter of walking away. It would have consequences, shame, and failure that would ripple outwards. Margaret knew this. It was the source of her power. She held not just Eleanor's future in her hands, but her family's past. Eleanor stared at the intricate pattern on the rug, unable to meet Margaret's triumphant gaze. The colors blurred together. She felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the hope of a happy marriage, but for herself. The person she was before Blackwood Manor had been whittled down, day by day, insult by insult, until only this trembling, silent figure remained. The anger was still there, a hot coal buried deep inside her, but it was trapped beneath a thick layer of fear. She had no voice, no power, no ground to stand on. Margaret seemed to sense her surrender. She watched Eleanor for another moment, her expression one of cold satisfaction, before turning her back. She walked back to her desk, the conversation, for her, clearly over. She had delivered her message, asserted her dominance, and now had more important matters to attend to. That will be all, she said, not even bothering to look up from her papers. You may go. The dismissal was the final crushing blow. It was not an invitation to leave. It was an order. The same tone one might use with a disobedient dog. Eleanor stood frozen for a second, her body trembling with a chaotic mixture of emotions. There was the terror of Margaret's threat, the raw pain of her words, and a white-hot, unfamiliar rage that burned in her throat. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something, to shatter the suffocating perfect stillness of this room. She wanted to tell Margaret that she was a human being, not a balance sheet, but no words came. Her throat was locked tight. The ancestral portraits on the wall seemed to smirk down at her. The fire crackled, indifferent. Margaret picked up her pen again, the world already moving on without her. With a monumental effort, Eleanor turned her body, which felt strangely heavy and disconnected from her. She walked towards the door, her legs unsteady. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee the house and never look back. But the fear held her in place. A cold hand wrapped around her heart. She did not look back at Margaret. She pulled the door open and stepped out into the hall, closing it gently behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place was like a cell door locking. She leaned against the cool wall, her forehead pressed against the wood-paneled surface, and finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It came out as a ragged, silent sob. Her entire body was shaking, not just from fear, but from the violent, suppressed fury of a soul that had just been told it was worthless. Margaret had dismissed her with a wave of her hand, leaving Eleanor trembling in the hallway, consumed by an anger she didn't know what to do with, and a fear that threatened to swallow her whole. The heavy study door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a judge's gavel. Eleanor did not return to her room. She could not bear the sight of the gilded cage, the silk sheets that felt like ice, the art on the walls that seemed to watch her with cold, indifferent eyes. Instead, her feet carried her through the cavernous halls of Blackwood Manor, her movements automatic, her mind a storm of Margaret's venomous words. She was a disappointment. Her position was conditional. Each phrase was a sharp stone pelting her already bruised spirit. She needed air, a space that was not polished and controlled, a place where she could breathe without inhaling the scent of beeswax and disapproval. Her path led her to a small, seldom-used door at the back of the West Wing. It opened onto the sprawling estate grounds, but she avoided the perfectly manicured lawns and the geometrically perfect hedges that Margaret supervised with an iron will. She followed a faint, overgrown path, one that the groundskeepers had long since ignored. It wound behind a line of ancient yew trees, their dark branches creating a somber tunnel. At the end of it, half hidden by a curtain of ivy, was a low, wrought iron gate. Its hinges groaned in protest as she pushed it open. She stepped into a forgotten world. This must have once been a private garden, perhaps a century ago. Now, nature was reclaiming it with a quiet, stubborn insistence. Wild roses, tangled and thorny, climbed over a crumbling stone wall. A small fountain, its cherubic statue stained green with age, was silent and dry, its basin filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. A single stone bench sat beneath a weeping willow, its surface covered in a soft blanket of moss. The air was different here. It smelled of damp earth, of decaying leaves, of the sweet, subtle perfume of resilient flowers. It smelled real. Eleanor sank onto the mossy bench, the cold stones seeping through her thin dress. She did not feel it. Her body was numb, a distant vessel for the turmoil raging within her. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to hold her shattering pieces together. The trembling that had started in Margaret's study returned, a violent shudder that racked her entire frame. A stoic, hot and raw, finally broke free from her throat. It was a sound of pure agony, swallowed by the rustling leaves and the indifferent sky. Here at least, no one could hear her. No one could judge her for the crime of having feelings. Her fingers fumbled at her neck, finding the cool, familiar shape of her mother's locket. She unclasped it, the simple silver oval a stark contrast to the opulence that suffocated her. Inside, the tiny, worn photograph of her mother's smiling face was a lifeline. Helen's eyes seemed to hold all the warmth that was absent from Blackwood Manor. Eleanor traced the faded image with her fingertip, a tear splashing onto the protective glass. What would her mother say if she saw her now? She had promised her she was happy, a lie that tasted more bitter with each passing day. She had traded her mother's warm, chaotic kitchen for this cold, silent tomb, all for a name and a fortune that felt like shackles. She had been so naive. She had believed in some secret, hopeful corner of her heart that love could grow even in the most sterile soil. She had seen Julian's detached politeness not as a permanent state, but as a challenge. She had thought her warmth could melt his reserve. She had thought that by being a good wife, a supportive partner, she could earn his affection, his respect. But all she had earned was his mother's scorn and his complete soul-crushing indifference. The marriage was not a partnership. It was a performance, and she was failing her audition. A footstep crunched on the gravel path behind her. Eleanor froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly wiped her eyes, snapping the locket shut and tucking it back beneath her collar. Her posture straightened instantly, the ingrained habit of composure taking over. She prepared herself for a servant, or worse, for Margaret, come to deliver another verbal blow. She turned, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. It was Julian. He stood at the entrance to the small, forgotten garden, his hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored trousers. He looked out of place, a figure of sharp lines and dark colors against the soft, untamed greens and grays of the garden. For a single foolish moment, her heart fluttered with a desperate hope. Had he followed her? Had he seen her distress after her meeting with his mother? Was he here to offer a word of comfort? To finally see her pain? He walked towards her, his expression unreadable. He did not rush. His steps were measured, his gaze sweeping over the overgrown garden with a flicker of distaste before settling on her. He stopped a few feet from the bench, not sitting beside her, but standing over her. The space between them felt like a mile-wide canyon. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was not soft, not concerned. It was the same clipped, businesslike tone he used with his staff. The flicker of hope inside her died, leaving behind a cold, heavy ash. She swallowed, forcing her own voice to remain steady. "Julian, I was just getting some air." He gave a slight, impatient nod, as if brushing aside her trivial explanation. "We need to discuss your recent disposition," he began, getting straight to the point. "It has become noticeable." Eleanor stared at him, bewildered. "My disposition?" "Your mood," he clarified, his tone sharpening with a hint of annoyance. "Your general air of unhappiness. The staff have commented on it. My mother is, shall we say, concerned about the atmosphere in the house." He spoke of her sadness as if it were a faulty appliance, a disruption to the household's smooth operation. A bitter, hysterical laugh almost escaped her, but she choked it down. "Your mother is the cause of the atmosphere in this house," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was the most defiant thing she had said to him in months. Julian's jaw tightened. He did not like being contradicted. "My mother is traditional. She has certain standards. Standards you agreed to uphold." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "Which brings me to the point of this conversation. Our arrangement." The word hung in the air between them, cold and metallic. "Arrangement," Eleanor repeated, the sound hollow. "Is that what this is to you? An arrangement?" "That is precisely what it is," he confirmed, his blue eyes cold and clear. "It was a mutually beneficial agreement. Your family's name and reputation provided a certain social stability. My family's resources provided you and your family with undeniable security. The terms were very clear." Eleanor felt a cold dread creeping up her spine. She could not believe what she was hearing. "And what were those terms, Julian? Remind me." He looked at her as if she were a particularly slow student. "The terms were a stable, quiet, and dignified union, one free of unnecessary emotional complications. Your role was to be a graceful partner, to manage the household with poise, to reflect the Croft name in a positive light. My role was to provide for you and secure our joint status." He paused, letting his words sink in. These public displays of melancholy were not part of the deal. They are inefficient. They create friction. Eleanor stared at his handsome, impassive face, the face she had once dreamed would soften with love for her. She saw it clearly now, not as a mask hiding a deeper well of feeling, but as the truth. There was nothing underneath. It was all surface. "Public displays? Julian, I was crying alone in a garden. I am your wife. Am I not allowed to be sad? Am I not allowed to be human?" Her voice cracked on the last word, the plea laid bare. His expression did not soften. It became even more rigid. "Feelings are a private matter, Eleanor. When they begin to affect the running of the house and cause my mother distress, they cease to be private. they become a problem I expect you to manage. The cruelty of it stole her breath. He was not asking her what was wrong. He was not offering to help. He was reprimanding her. He was giving her a performance review, and she was failing. The hope she had clung to for 2 long years, the fragile belief that he might one day see her, truly see her, crumbled into dust. He did not see a wife, a partner, a woman in pain. He saw a component that was malfunctioning. She looked down at her hands, clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. The image of the locket burned behind her eyelids. The warmth of her mother's love, the life she had left behind, it all felt like a world away, a dream she once had. She had made a terrible bargain. She had traded her heart for a contract. I see, she said, her voice flat and devoid of all emotion. There was nothing left to feel but a vast, empty coldness that mirrored his own. Julian seemed to take her quiet response as acceptance, as an agreement to correct her behavior. He had addressed the issue, stated his expectations, and now considered the matter resolved. Good, he said with a curt nod. I have a call with the Tokyo office in 10 minutes. I trust we will not need to have this conversation again. He did not wait for a reply. He did not offer a hand to help her up. He did not give her a parting glance. He simply turned his back on her, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel as he walked away, leaving her alone in the forgotten garden. Eleanor watched him go, his figure disappearing behind the dark yew trees. The silence he left behind was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the willow branches. The tears were gone now, replaced by a horrifying, crystal-clear certainty. She finally understood. She was not a disappointment to him because she was sad. She was a disappointment because her sadness was inconvenient. It was a flaw in the product he had acquired. He walked away, leaving Eleanor to realize that to her husband, she was not a partner, but a poorly performing asset. The late afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor. Eleanor sat on a cold stone bench, tucked away in a secluded part of the garden where Julian had left her. The air was still, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of roses that were beginning to wilt at the edges. She traced the harsh, geometric lines of the boxwood hedge with her eyes. Everything here was pruned, controlled, forced into a shape it was never meant to hold. Just like her. He had called their marriage an arrangement, a deal where her emotional displays were a breach of contract, a poorly performing asset. The words echoed in the quiet of her mind, stripping away the last, thin layer of hope she had clung to for 3 long years. A chill seeped through her thin dress from the stone beneath her, a cold that felt ancient and deep. It was a familiar feeling, one that pulled her back through time, away from the dying roses and the oppressive silence of the manor. The chill was not from the garden bench. It was from a polished leather chair in a room that smelled of old paper and ambition. A room where her future had been negotiated. The memory rose unbidden, as sharp and clear as if it were happening right now. It was 3 years ago. The room was on the top floor of a prestigious law firm downtown. The windows overlooked the city, but the heavy mahogany panels and shelves of leather-bound books seemed to suck all the light and air out of the space. It felt less like an office and more like a vault. She remembered the feeling of her own hands, clammy and cold, clasped tightly in her lap. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue silk that her mother had helped her choose. It had felt elegant and mature that morning. In this room, it felt like a child's costume. Her father, Thomas Vance, sat beside her. His face, usually so full of life and easy humor, was drawn and serious. He kept adjusting his tie, a nervous gesture she had never seen before. Across the vast, gleaming table sat Margaret Croft, her posture as rigid as a queen on her throne. Her silver hair was a perfect helmet, and her eyes, a pale, judgmental blue, missed nothing. They swept over Eleanor, not with warmth, but with the cool appraisal of a buyer inspecting merchandise. And next to Margaret, silent and composed, was Julian. He looked then as he did now, impossibly handsome and utterly remote. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit that made him look more like a sculpture of a man than a man himself. His dark hair was precisely cut, his jaw sharp. When their eyes met for a brief moment as she entered the room, his expression did not change. There was no smile, no flicker of interest, just a cool, polite acknowledgement. A younger, more naive Eleanor had told herself it was solemnity, a seriousness befitting the occasion. She had told herself that beneath that calm exterior, there must be a current of feeling. She had wanted so desperately to believe it. Her father cleared his throat, the sound unnervously loud in the heavy silence. Well, he began, looking at a fixed point on the table. We are all here to finalize the details of this wonderful union. He tried for a smile, but it didn't reach his tired eyes. A joining of two distinguished families. A continuation of legacy. Margaret offered a thin, bloodless smile in return. Indeed, Thomas. The Croft name has a long and storied history in this county. We value tradition. We value stability. She shifted her gaze to Eleanor, and the smile vanished. My son requires a partner who understands the importance of these things. A wife who will be a credit to the family name. Someone graceful, quiet, and aware of her duties. Each word was a carefully polished stone dropped into a still pond, creating ripples of expectation that lapped at Eleanor's feet. Quiet. The word hung in the air. It was a requirement, not a personality trait. Eleanor felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She took a slow sip of the iced water from the crystal glass in front of her. It tasted of nothing. She wanted to say something, to ask what her duties were, to insist that she was more than just a quiet and graceful addition to a family tree. But she looked at her father. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the slight tremble in his hand as he rested it on the table. She knew her family's name was old and respected, but she also knew, in a way she was not supposed to, that respect didn't pay the bills. Her father had made some poor investments, a series of unlucky ventures that had slowly eroded their comfortable life. This marriage was not just a union, it was a lifeline. He was selling his only daughter, not for gold, but for survival, dressed up in the language of legacy and honor. Eleanor is a good girl, her father said, his voice strained. She was raised properly. She understands what is required. He did not look at her when he said it. He was speaking to Margaret, man to man, closing a deal. Eleanor felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were floating near the ceiling, watching a play about a girl who looked just like her. Julian had remained silent through the entire exchange. He simply sat there, his long fingers steepled, his gaze directed at the legal documents spread before them. He seemed completely uninterested in the discussion of his future wife's character. For him, it appeared the matter was already settled. He was acquiring a company, and the terms were being read aloud. Eleanor found herself studying his face, searching for any crack in the marble facade. Was he nervous? Was he excited? Was he anything at all? His blue eyes were like the surface of a frozen lake, betraying nothing of the depths below. Then Margaret turned her attention to the practicalities. She spoke of the prenuptial agreement in a flat, businesslike tone. She detailed the assets that would remain solely under the Croft name, the trusts, the estates. It was a clinical, brutal accounting of their immense wealth and the invisible, impenetrable wall that would forever stand between Eleanor and it. She was to be given a generous allowance, access to the homes, a place in society. In exchange, she would provide a respectable companionship, an heir if possible, and above all, no trouble. No scandals, no emotional scenes. Eleanor's throat felt tight. This was not the talk of love or partnership or building a life together. This was the language of a merger. She risked a glance at Julian, her heart pounding a desperate rhythm against her ribs. He must feel something. This must be as strange for him as it was for her. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the polished expanse of the table. For a single, breathless second, she thought she saw something. A flicker of doubt, perhaps. A hint of shared humanity in this cold, sterile transaction. He spoke for the first time, his voice even and calm. The terms are agreeable to me, he said, not to Eleanor, but to the lawyers in the room. And just like that, the flicker was gone. His gaze slid from her face back to the papers, dismissing her. The hope that had fluttered in her chest moments before died, turning into a cold, heavy weight. This was it. This was the man she was agreeing to spend her life with. A man who discussed his marriage with the same emotional investment as he would the purchase of a new car. A small voice screamed inside her head, "Don't do this. Stand up. Walk out of this room and never look back." She could feel the words on the tip of her tongue. She could imagine the shock on their faces, the freedom she would feel walking out that door. But then she saw her father's face again. She saw the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes, the desperate hope that this would fix everything. He had always given her everything he could. He had read her stories at night, taught her how to ride a bicycle, and told her she was the most precious thing in his life. Now he was asking her for this. He was asking her to save them, and he was too proud to say the word. How could she refuse him? How could she choose her own uncertain happiness over the security of her entire family? Margaret slid a pen across the table. Eleanor, dear, if you would. It was not a question. All eyes were on her. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic far below. She looked from her father's pleading eyes to Margaret's expectant stare. Finally, she looked at Julian. He was watching her now, his face a perfect, unreadable mask. She searched his eyes one last time for a promise, a connection, a single reason to believe that this was more than just a contract. She found nothing. There was only a calm, patient waiting. He was waiting for her to play her part, to sign on the dotted line. And in that moment, a different, more foolish hope was born, a dangerous, romantic notion that maybe, just maybe, she could be the one to change him. Maybe she could be the one to break through that icy exterior. Maybe her love, her warmth, her presence could teach him how to feel. She could bring life into the cold, still rooms of his house, and into the cold, still corners of his heart. It was the hope of a girl who had read too many novels, a girl who still believed that love could conquer all. She reached for the pen, her fingers felt numb. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I agree. She signed her name, her hand moving automatically. The signature looked shaky, foreign. It was the signature of a stranger. With that single stroke of ink, Eleanor Vance ceased to be her own person. She became an asset, a solution, a future Mrs. Croft. The memory dissolved like mist. The leather of the chair became the cold stone of the garden bench once more. The sterile air of the law office was replaced by the scent of damp earth and dying flowers. The calculated voices faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. Eleanor shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The foolish hope she had felt that day seemed like a cruel joke now. She had not changed him. She had not brought warmth or life to Blackwood Manor. The house had changed her instead. It had drained her, quieted her, and pruned her into a shape she no longer recognized. He had not been a man waiting to be saved. He was exactly what he appeared to be. A cold, empty man who had made a practical decision. She looked at her hands, resting in her lap, just as they had been on that day. They were no longer the hands of a hopeful girl. They were the hands of a woman trapped in a gilded cage she had willingly walked into. The memory fades, leaving the present-day Eleanor wondering if she ever had a choice at all. The memory of the past had left a bitter taste in her mouth, one that even the weak, lukewarm tea on the breakfast table could not wash away. She had spent the night wrestling with ghosts, replaying the cold finality of her marriage agreement. Had she ever had a choice? The question echoed in the cavernous spaces of her mind, unanswered. Morning arrived not as a relief but as a continuation. The light filtering through the tall, arched windows of the breakfast room was thin and gray, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. It was a cold light, one that offered no warmth, only clarity. It made the polished silver gleam with an unforgiving chill, and the stiff, white linen of the tablecloth looked like a field of snow. Eleanor sat with her back straight, a posture drilled into her by Margaret since the day she arrived at Blackwood Manor. She stared at her plate, an untouched piece of toast sitting forlornly upon it. Across the vast mahogany table, Julian was hidden behind the rustling pages of a newspaper. The sound was sharp, impatient, a tiny act of aggression against the oppressive silence. To her left, Margaret Croft sat like a marble statue, her presence a constant, heavy pressure. The only sounds were the precise, almost silent movements of the staff who drifted in and out, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. It felt like it was counting down the seconds of Eleanor's life. She held her silver fork, its weight familiar in her hand. The Croft family crest, a lion and a hawk locked in combat, was embossed on the handle. Her thumb traced the sharp edges of the design. She focused on the cold metal against her skin, a small, grounding sensation in a world that felt increasingly unreal. She could feel a tremor starting in her fingers and tightened her grip, willing it to stop. She could not show weakness. Not here, not in front of Margaret. The silence was finally broken by a sigh. It was Margaret's signature opening, a soft exhalation of disappointment that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken criticisms. This marmalade, she announced to no one in particular, is far too sweet. It's terribly unsophisticated. She pushed the small crystal jar an inch away from her, a gesture of complete dismissal. Eleanor said nothing. She knew this was not about the marmalade. It was never about the marmalade, or the flowers, or the temperature of the room. It was about her. Every complaint was a carefully aimed dart, and she was the intended target. Julian turned a page, the crackle of the paper filling the room for a moment. He did not look up. He was a master of strategic deafness, tuning out the domestic frequencies that he considered beneath his attention. To him, this was just noise. Margaret, however, was not one to be ignored. She placed her knife and fork down on her plate with a delicate yet resonant clink. The sound made Eleanor flinch. "I was speaking with Beatrice Ashworth yesterday," Margaret began, her voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "You remember the Ashworths, Julian? An old, respectable family. Their son, Thomas, recently married a young woman from a Swiss banking dynasty." She paused, letting the information settle. Eleanor felt her stomach clench. She knew what was coming next. "Apparently," Margaret continued, her eyes now fixed on a point just over Eleanor's shoulder, "the girl is remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. She speaks 4 languages fluently, has a degree in art history from the Sorbonne, and has already used her family connections to secure a place for Thomas on the advisory board of the National Museum. She is an asset, a true partner, someone who elevates the family." The word elevates hung in the air, shimmering with malice. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She kept her eyes down, studying the intricate weave of the damask napkin in her lap. She could feel Margaret's gaze on her now, cold and analytical, assessing her for the 1,000th time and finding her wanting. "One does have certain hopes for the continuation of a family line," Margaret mused, her voice taking on a wistful, theatrical quality. "One hopes for a daughter-in-law who will be a credit to the name. Someone with ambition, with presence, someone impressive." She let out another soft, mournful sigh. "It is so disappointing when those hopes are not met." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. This was more direct than usual, a public declaration of her failure. Eleanor's throat felt tight. A desperate, childish part of her wanted to look at Julian, to send a silent plea across the mahogany expanse. "Help me. Say something. Defend me." But she knew he wouldn't. He never did. To him, this was simply his mother's unpleasant morning ritual, as predictable and meaningless as the weather. Involving himself would be inefficient. But today, something was different. Perhaps Margaret's performance was too pointed, her complaints too close to an accusation against his own judgment. The rustling of the newspaper stopped. Julian slowly lowered the paper and placed it on the table beside his plate. The gesture was deliberate, final. The room held its breath. He did not look at Eleanor. His cold blue eyes were fixed on his mother. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the first real emotion he had shown all morning. It was not the righteous anger of a husband defending his wife. It was the irritation of a busy man whose quiet morning had been needlessly disturbed. He wanted to end the conversation. He wanted to solve the problem. "Mother," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. He picked up his coffee cup, his movements economical and precise. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. He was asserting his control, reminding her who held the real power at this table. Margaret waited, a faint, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had finally gotten his attention. She had won. Julian placed the cup back in its saucer with a soft click. He leaned back slightly in his chair, a man utterly at ease, about to deliver a simple, irrefutable truth. He was going to put a stop to this tiresome subject once and for all. And then he spoke the words that would unravel everything. "I married her," he said, his voice a cool, level blade of sound, because she was ordinary enough not to cause trouble. He paused, letting the statement land with its full, devastating weight. He was still looking at his mother, explaining his logic, the rationale behind his business decision. Eleanor was merely the subject of the transaction, a piece on a chessboard, a simple, quiet arrangement, he concluded. He then picked up his newspaper again, a clear signal that the matter was closed. The discussion was over. The words did not echo. They fell into the silence and were absorbed, becoming part of the room itself. They settled on the polished furniture and clung to the heavy velvet drapes. Ordinary enough not to cause trouble. A simple, quiet arrangement. The grandfather clock in the hall continued to tick, each sound a hammer blow against Eleanor's shattered perception of herself. She slowly lifted her head. The room seemed to tilt, the distances between objects shifting and distorting. She looked at Margaret. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated victory. Her eyes gleamed with a cold fire. She had finally broken her. Then Eleanor's gaze moved to her husband, Julian. He had already turned a page. His brow was slightly furrowed as he scanned an article about fluctuating stock prices. He was completely absorbed. He had delivered the sentence that had just demolished his wife's world and had already moved on. It meant nothing to him. It was a statement of fact, no more emotional than noting the time. Ordinary. The words spun in her mind. All her life she had tried to be good, to be kind, to be thoughtful. She had believed those qualities had value. She had entered this marriage with a tiny, secret seed of hope that this cool, handsome man might one day see those qualities in her, that he might see past the arrangement and find a person worth knowing, worth perhaps even loving. She had watered that seed with small kindnesses, with patient smiles, with her unending, silent tolerance for his family's cruelty. She had protected it, nurtured it in the dark, hoping it might one day break through the cold ground of their marriage. Now she saw the truth. He had seen those qualities all along. He had seen her quiet nature, her desire to please, her reluctance to create conflict, and he had not seen them as virtues. He had seen them as features, the useful features of an appliance, the manageable traits of a pet. She was not a partner. She was a convenience. He chose her not for who she was, but for everything she was not. She was not ambitious. She was not difficult. She was not remarkable. She was ordinary. Ordinary enough not to cause trouble. The ache that had been her constant companion in this house, the dull throb of loneliness and quiet despair, was suddenly gone. In its place was a vast, empty space, a void. It was the feeling of a rope, stretched taut for years, finally snapping. There was no sound, just a sudden, terrifying release of tension. Her hand, which had been gripping the silver fork so tightly, went limp. She didn't feel it slip from her fingers. The clatter as it hit the porcelain plate was unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Both Julian and Margaret looked up, startled by the noise. But Eleanor did not notice their expressions. She was staring at Julian's face, at the handsome, indifferent mask he wore. She saw him for the first time not as the man she had hoped to love, but as the architect of her profound and utter insignificance. The cruel words hung in the air between them, invisible but solid, a wall she could never hope to breach. Her heart, which had endured so much, which had hoped so foolishly, did not just ache. It was not a poetic pain. It was a physical sensation, a deep, silent fracture right down the center. It was the feeling of something vital inside her, the very last flicker of hope, finally and completely breaking. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with the weight of Julian's words, heavy and suffocating. Eleanor felt them land not in her ears, but in the center of her chest, a physical blow that stole her breath. For a moment, the world dissolved into a blur of muted color and distant sound. The ornate pattern of the silver, the precise cut of the crystal glass, the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. All of it faded into a low, humming frequency inside her own head. Then, a sharp clatter cut through the void. Her fork, heavy with the Croft family crest, slipped from her numb fingers and struck the porcelain plate. The sound was unnaturally loud in the breakfast room, a single sharp crack in the perfect cold stillness. It was the sound of something finally breaking. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Eleanor raised her head. The hope she had guarded so fiercely for years, a small, stubborn flame in the vast emptiness of this house, was gone. It had not flickered out. It had been extinguished instantly, doused by the cold, casual cruelty of her husband's confession. Her gaze drifted first to him. Julian was looking at his plate, a faint line of annoyance etched between his brows, as if her dropped fork was the only disturbance. He had not said it to hurt her. That was the most painful part. He had said it as a simple statement of fact, a piece of strategic information shared with his mother, an explanation for a business decision. She was the asset he had acquired, one chosen for its low maintenance, ordinary enough not to cause trouble. The words echoed, stripping away every polite fiction, every carefully constructed illusion she had used to survive. Her eyes then moved to Margaret. The matriarch was watching her, a triumphant, venomous little smirk playing on her lips. It was the look of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. In Margaret's eyes, Eleanor saw the culmination of years of quiet warfare. Every backhanded compliment, every dismissive gesture, every calculated slight had been leading to this moment. This was Margaret's victory, delivered by her own son. She had successfully proven what she had believed all along, that Eleanor was an imposter, a common girl playing dress-up, unworthy of the Croft name. And now Julian had finally agreed. The alliance of two against one was complete and absolute. Eleanor was utterly, irrevocably alone. A profound and terrible clarity washed over her. It was a feeling colder and harder than despair. It was the truth. She had spent so long trying to earn her place at this table. She had learned the proper way to address the staff, the correct forks to use, the acceptable topics of conversation. She had muted her own laughter because it was deemed too loud, hidden her favorite books because they were not serious enough. She had molded herself into the quiet, elegant shape they required, hoping that one day they would see not the shape, but the person inside. She had hoped for a flicker of warmth from Julian, a single moment of genuine connection that would make the sacrifice worthwhile. She remembered a time, months ago, when she had been ill with a fever. He had come into her room and placed a cool hand on her forehead. For a week she had clung to that memory as proof of his hidden affection. Now she saw it for what it was, a cursory check on a valuable possession. The pain was immense, a white-hot agony that threatened to tear a scream from her throat. But no scream came. The tears that pricked at the back of her eyes did not fall. Something else was rising through the pain, something she had not felt in a very long time. It was a quiet, unyielding strength. It was the bedrock of her own soul, long buried under layers of compromise and fear. The desire to please, the need for their approval. It all just fell away. Like a heavy coat she had been forced to wear for years, she could finally feel its suffocating weight, and she knew she could no longer bear it. To stay here now, after this, would not just be a compromise. It would be a complete annihilation of self. They had not just insulted her, they had defined her, and in her silence she had accepted their definition. Ordinary, simple, quiet, in arrangement. She looked down at her hands resting in her lap. They were trembling slightly. She willed them to be still. She thought of her mother, Helen, in her warm, cluttered kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. Her mother had never cared about being impressive. She cared about being kind. She cared about being real. The memory was a lifeline in the icy waters of the breakfast room. The simple silver locket she wore under her dress felt suddenly warm against her skin, a secret anchor to a world where she was not an arrangement, but a beloved daughter, a person. The choice became blindingly simple. She could shatter here in front of them and give Margaret the satisfaction of her tears, or she could stand up and walk away. With a strange, newfound calm, Eleanor reached for the starched linen napkin beside her plate. Her movements were deliberate, graceful, a pantomime of the perfect wife she was supposed to be. She did not crumple it. She did not throw it down. She folded it neatly in half and placed it on the table, next to the plate where her uneaten breakfast grew cold. It was a small, final act of order in the midst of her world collapsing. It was a signal, to herself more than to them, that this was not a moment of emotional chaos. This was a decision. Julian finally looked up from his plate, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to ask what she was doing, to scold her for the interruption. But he was too late. Eleanor pushed her chair back. The heavy wood scraped softly against the marble floor, another small, sharp sound in the stillness. She rose to her feet. She felt impossibly tall, as if she had been sitting hunched over for years and was only now straightening her spine. She did not look at Julian. She did not look at Margaret Webb. She looked straight ahead at the tall, arching doorway that led out into the grand hall. It was no longer the entrance to a gilded cage. It was an exit. Without a single word, without a glance back, she turned. She began to walk. Her steps were not rushed. They were even, measured and firm on the cold marble. Each footfall was a declaration. Left foot, I am no longer your arrangement. Right foot, I am not ordinary. Left foot, I will not be quiet. Right foot, I am leaving. The air in the breakfast room remained frozen. Julian stared at the empty chair, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. This was not in the script. Eleanor was supposed to be predictable. She was supposed to be manageable. This quiet, resolute defiance was something he had never seen and did not understand. Margaret's triumphant smirk faltered, replaced by a look of stunned indignation. She had expected hysterics, pleading, a satisfying scene of emotional collapse. This silent, dignified departure was an insult. It denied her the climax of her victory. It was as if Eleanor had simply decided the game was over and had walked off the board. They both watched as her form receded down the long, sun-drenched corridor. Her footsteps echoed back into the room, each one a final, undeniable punctuation mark at the end of a long and painful chapter. The sound was clear, sharp, and carried the unmistakable ring of finality. Then she turned a corner and was gone from their sight. Her footsteps continued to echo down the marble hall as Julian and Margaret watched the empty space where she had been, momentarily stunned by her uncharacteristic defiance. Her footsteps made no sound on the thick runner of the grand staircase. Each step upward was a silent, deliberate motion. The cold marble of the hall below was already a memory, a place where a different woman had lived, a woman who hoped, a woman who flinched. That woman was gone, left behind at the breakfast table next to a single discarded silver fork. The air in the upper hall was still and cool, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax. It was the smell of preservation, of things kept perfect and untouched for generations. It was the smell of a beautiful tomb. She did not pause at the threshold of her bedroom. She pushed the heavy oak door, and it swung inward without a sound, a testament to the perfect, frictionless engineering of the Croft household. The room was vast, a sea of pale blues and creams. Sunlight poured through the tall, arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, lost souls. For 2 years, this room had been her sanctuary and her prison, a place to retreat to after Margaret's daily critiques, a place to wait for a husband who rarely came and who was a stranger when he did. Today, she saw it for what it was, a showroom, a perfectly curated space designed to exhibit the wife of Julian Croft. Her eyes swept over it all, but she felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, not even loss. There was only a profound and unsettling calm. It was the quiet that follows a storm, when the sky is washed clean and the world feels new and strangely empty. Her gaze passed over the vanity table. An array of crystal perfume bottles sat like a collection of jewels, each one a gift from Julian. He had never once commented on her scent, but he expected her to wear them. They were part of the uniform. Next to them, a velvet-lined box lay open. Instantly, a diamond necklace glittered, a piece Margaret had begrudgingly given her for the family's last charity gala. It had felt cold and heavy against her skin that night, like a beautiful ornate chain. Eleanor walked past it all without a second glance. These things were not hers. They were props. They belonged to the character she had been playing. She went directly to the walk-in wardrobe, a room larger than the living room of her childhood home. Racks of designer dresses hung in color-coordinated perfection. Silks and cashmeres and velvets, fabrics meant to be seen, not felt. Shoes were arranged on slanted shelves, their heels sharp and precise. Handbags sat on glass tiers like museum pieces. She had worn these clothes to dinners, to galas, to weekend gatherings where she smiled until her jaw ached. She had played the part of the elegant, serene Mrs. Croft, all while her spirit was slowly being starved. Her hand brushed against the sleeve of a silk blouse, the one she wore the day Julian told her they needed to present a more united front for a business magazine feature. He had held her hand for the photograph, his grip firm and cool, his eyes looking straight at the camera, not at her. She pulled her hand back as if the fabric had burned her. She would not take any of it. To take even a single thread would be to admit it had meant something, that it had been real. She moved to the very back of the wardrobe, behind a row of winter coats that smelled of cedar and disuse. There on the floor, covered by a simple dust bag, was a single old suitcase. It was made of worn brown leather, its corners scuffed, its handle softened from use. It was the suitcase she had arrived with at Blackwood Manor, a relic from another life. She pulled it out, the weight of it familiar and grounding. She laid it on the enormous empty bed, the scuffed leather a stark rebellion against the pristine white duvet. There was no hesitation. Her movements were methodical, almost trance-like. She knew exactly what she was looking for. She bypassed the drawers of delicate lingerie and silk stockings, opening a lower drawer that held the few things she had kept from her old life. She pulled out a pair of worn jeans and a soft gray sweater. She folded them carefully. Her fingers lingered on the soft wool of the sweater. She remembered her mother, Helen, knitting it for her one cold winter. Helen had complained that the stitches were uneven, but Eleanor had loved it because it was warm and it was made by her mother's hands. Next, she gathered her books. They were stacked on a small, unassuming shelf near the window, a corner of the room that Margaret had once called cluttered. There were only a dozen or so, novels with cracked spines and dog-eared pages, a book of poetry whose cover was faded by the sun. These were her friends. They had been her only real companions in this silent house. In their pages, she had found worlds where people felt deeply, loved fiercely, and made mistakes. Worlds where being ordinary was not a liability. She stacked them neatly inside the suitcase one by one. The weight of them was satisfying, solid, real. She thought of Julian's words again, a simple, quiet arrangement. Ordinary enough not to cause trouble. The words no longer stung. They had been transformed from an insult into a key. He was right. She was ordinary. She was not a Croft. She did not have a soul made of ice and ambition. Her heart was not a ledger for calculating social gains. She was just a woman who had once dared to hope for love inside a business contract. The foolishness of it all washed over her, but it was a gentle wave, not a crushing one. It was the kind of foolishness she could forgive. Then her fingers found what they were searching for. From a small hidden pouch in her travel bag, she retrieved the simple silver locket. It was plain, unadorned, and cool to the touch. She opened the clasp. Inside, the tiny, worn photograph of her mother smiled back at her. Helen's eyes were kind, her expression full of the unconditional love that Eleanor had been so starved of. A single tear, hot and sharp, finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness for the life she was leaving. It was a tear of profound, aching relief. It was a tear for the woman in the photograph who had been waiting for her daughter to come home. She clutched the locket in her fist, the metal pressing into her palm. This was her lineage, not the cold, predatory crest of the Croft hawk and lion. Her heritage was one of warm kitchens, messy gardens, and hands that held you when you cried. It was a legacy of love, not power. She had traded it for a hollow name, in a cold bed, and the price had been her own soul. But now she was buying it back. She packed a few more essentials. Simple cotton shirts, the comfortable flat shoes she wore when she dared to walk in the far corners of the garden, away from the prying eyes of the staff. Each item was a piece of herself she was reclaiming. She was shedding the skin of Eleanor Croft, a woman who existed only on paper and in photographs. She was becoming Eleanor Vance again. Or perhaps she was simply becoming Eleanor for the very first time. A person defined not by her husband or her mother-in-law or her name, but by her own choices. The suitcase was not full. It was mostly empty, just like when she had arrived. She had accumulated so much in 2 years, a mountain of expensive, meaningless things. And yet, she was leaving with nothing more than what she could carry. The thought should have been terrifying. The prospect of having nothing, of being nothing in the eyes of the world she was leaving, should have filled her with dread. But it didn't. It filled her with a dizzying sense of lightness. She was unburdened, free. She stood for a moment looking around the silent, opulent room one last time. She saw the ghost of herself sitting by the window, waiting. She saw the ghost of herself lying awake in the dark, listening for footsteps that never came. She saw the ghost of herself practicing a polite smile in the mirror, her eyes hollow. She felt a quiet pang of pity for that woman, but that woman was no longer her. With a final steady breath, she reached down and took hold of the two sides of the suitcase. She pulled them together, the teeth of the zipper aligned. She drew the metal tab across its track. The sound of the zipper closing sliced through the silence of the room. It was a sharp, final, and decisive sound. The sound of a door being locked. The sound of a chapter ending. The final metallic sound of the zipper echoed in the opulent silence of the bedroom. For a moment, that small noise was the loudest thing in Blackwood Manor. It was the sound of a lock clicking shut on a life she no longer wanted. Eleanor's hand rested on the worn leather of the suitcase. Her fingers were steady. Inside her, the storm of 1,000 unshed tears had finally passed, leaving behind a strange and unnerving calm. The pain was still there, a cold, heavy stone settled deep in her chest, but it no longer had the power to make her tremble. It was simply a part of her now, a weight she had learned to carry. She heard his footsteps in the hall. They were fast, impatient, the sharp, confident clicks of a man who owned every floorboard he walked upon. He never knocked. The concept was foreign to him. His world and everyone in it was accessible at his convenience. The heavy oak door swung open, hitting the stopper with a dull thud. Julian stood in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. His suit was perfect, his dark hair was immaculate, and his cold blue eyes swept the room with irritation. They landed on the suitcase beside her, and his lips thinned into a line of contempt. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air, sharp as glass. "What new melodrama are you performing, Eleanor?" He walked into the room, leaving the door ajar. He moved as if he were approaching a mess that needed to be managed, a problem to be solved with brisk efficiency. He saw her action not as a decision, but as a display, an inconvenient emotional outburst. Eleanor slowly turned to face him. She did not flinch from his gaze. For years she had lowered her eyes, seeking peace and submission, hoping to placate the coldness she saw there. But now she met it head-on. Her own gray eyes, which had so often been clouded with hurt or pleading, were clear. They were like the surface of a frozen lake, still and deep and unreadable. The woman he saw was not the one who had left the breakfast table an hour ago. That woman was gone. "The arrangement is terminated," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a finality that made the air in the room feel thin. There was no tremor in it, no hint of the weeping she had done in secret for 2 years. He had never seen her cry. He never would. Julian actually stopped. For a fraction of a second, a look of genuine confusion crossed his handsome features. It was as if she had started speaking a language he did not understand. Then his default expression of dismissive authority returned. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Terminated? Don't be ridiculous. This isn't some business luncheon you can just walk away from. This is our marriage." "No," Eleanor corrected him gently, a strange politeness in her tone. "This was a contract, an agreement. You said so yourself many times." She took a small step away from the bed, creating more space between them. She needed the air. She felt as if she had been holding her breath since the day she arrived. "You got your quiet, ordinary wife, the one who wouldn't cause trouble." She paused, letting his own words settle in the space between them. "Now she will quietly and ordinarily leave." The echo of his cruelty, spoken back to him with such placid resolve, seemed to physically jolt him. His jaw tightened. This was not the script he knew. He was used to her tears, her pain silences, her fragile attempts to please him. This calm, articulate stranger was someone he could not manipulate. He could not find the levers of control. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice rising slightly. He took a step closer, invading the space she had just made. "You're having some kind of episode. Because of what I said at breakfast? It was to shut my mother up. You know how she is. You can't seriously be throwing all this away over a few careless words. Eleanor looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. He did not even believe his words were cruel. He saw them as a tool, a means to an end. He saw her reaction as an overreaction, an illogical emotional response to a practical statement. He was incapable of understanding that those words were not the wound. They were simply the final press on a wound that had been festering for years. It was not a few careless words, Julian, she replied, her voice still impossibly even. It was the truth, the most honest thing you have ever said to me, and I am grateful for it. It made everything perfectly clear. She glanced around the room at the silk wallpaper, the ornate gilded mirror, the chaise lounge upholstered in velvet. It was all a set, a beautiful, lifeless stage for a play she was no longer willing to perform in. These things had once intimidated her, made her feel small and unworthy. Now they just looked empty. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare sign of agitation. Clear? What is clear? That you're going to walk out of here with that pathetic little suitcase and do what exactly? Go back to that tiny cottage in your mother's garden? What life do you think you have without me, without this family? He gestured around the room as if its sheer opulence was an irrefutable argument. Everything you have because of the Croft name. The threat was there, wrapped in a question. The classic Croft maneuver. Remind the lesser opponent of all they stand to lose. But the threat had no teeth anymore. She had already lost everything that mattered. Her sense of self, her hope, her spirit. What he was threatening her with was the loss of a cage. I had a life before the Croft name, she said softly. A small one perhaps, an ordinary one, but it was mine. Her gaze flickered to the dressing table, where the fine jewelry he had bought her sat in velvet boxes. Gifts that were not gifts, but investments in the image of his wife. Her eyes settled instead on the simple silver locket at her throat. Her fingers instinctively went to it, the cool metal of familiar comfort against her skin. It was the only thing in this room that held any real value. Julian's frustration was boiling over. He was a man who solved problems with money, power, and logical ultimatums. He was trying all three and failing. This is a breach of contract, Eleanor. Our families have an agreement. There are legal and financial implications. Do you have any idea the scandal this will cause? The damage to our reputation? He was talking about appearances, about finance, about public opinion. He was talking about everything except her, everything except the woman standing before him, her heart shattered by his calculated indifference. He still saw her as a component in a larger machine, a piece that was suddenly malfunctioning and threatening the entire operation. Your reputation is your concern, she stated simply. It always has been. She had been a part of that reputation, a carefully chosen accessory. Now she was removing herself. He would have to find another way to manage the optics. He took another step, his shadow falling over her. He was so close now she could smell the faint, expensive scent of his cologne. It was a smell she had once tried to love, a smell that now made her feel suffocated. He reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was not violent, but it was firm, demanding, a physical assertion of ownership. Eleanor, stop this foolishness. Unpack your bag. We will discuss this later, when you are feeling more rational. For a single terrifying second, the old fear flickered inside her. The instinct to obey, to smooth things over, to retreat. His touch was a reminder of his power, of the world he commanded. But then she looked at his hand on her arm, at the perfectly manicured fingers in the expensive watch at his wrist, and she felt a surge of something new. Not anger, but a cold, clear strength. She did not pull away violently. She simply placed her free hand over his, and with quiet, deliberate pressure, she uncurled his fingers from her arm. She let go as if she were setting down a piece of porcelain she no longer wished to hold. The action was more shocking to him than a slap would have been. He stared at his hand, now empty, as if it had betrayed him. He looked back at her face, searching for a crack in her composure, a tear, a tremor, anything he could use. He found nothing. only the calm, steady gaze of a woman who was already gone. "There is nothing left to discuss," she said. Her voice was a whisper, but it was the whisper of a door closing for the last time. "You wanted a simple arrangement. This is the simplest ending imaginable." She turned away from him then, her back straight and her movements unhurried. She walked to the small suitcase resting on the priceless Persian rug. The handle was cool and familiar in her grasp. It felt real. It felt like her own. Everything else in the room was a ghost. She did not give him a final pleading look. She did not offer a parting shot of anger. The argument was over because she was no longer participating in it. The game was finished because she had walked off the board. With the suitcase in her hand, she walked towards the door he had left open. She did not rush. Her steps were even and measured on the thick carpet. Each one was a step away from the cold, gilded prison and a step closer to the small, warm light of the life she had almost forgotten. As she passed him, she did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the hallway beyond, on the path that led out. The space between them was charged with all the words they had never said, with all the love that had never been. She stepped out of the bedroom and into the grand, empty hall. She did not look back. She could feel his presence behind her, a pillar of stunned silence. He was frozen in the middle of the room he owned, surrounded by the wealth he commanded, utterly powerless. He had used his words to build a wall around her, to define her, to diminish her. And with her silence and a single quiet action, she had walked right through it. For the very first time since she had known him, Julian Croft was completely, utterly speechless. She did not slam the bedroom door. She closed it gently, the latch clicking into place with a soft finality that was louder than any shout. Behind her, into the opulent room that had been her cage, Julian stood frozen, a statue of disbelief. The silence he offered was more telling than any argument he could have made. It was the sound of a man who had just realized his perfectly calculated world had a variable he never accounted for. Eleanor did not need to hear him. She could feel his shock radiating through the thick wood of the door, a cold wave that no longer touched her. Her own heart was a steady, quiet drum. Her hand, holding the worn handle of her single suitcase, was firm. The weight was familiar, grounding. It contained nothing of the Crofts. It contained only Eleanor Vance. She turned and faced the long, shadowed hallway of Blackwood Manor. For years, this corridor had felt like a gauntlet. Every step was measured, every glance evaluated. The portraits of Julian's ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge her posture, her dress, her very presence. Today she met their gaze. She saw them not as imposing judges, but as relics. They were figures trapped in oil and varnish, shackled to a name she was now leaving behind. One by one she passed the closed doors. The library, where Margaret had once informed her she was a disappointment. The music room with its grand piano she was never encouraged to play. The small drawing room where she had spent countless evenings in silence, listening to the ticking of a grandfather clock while Julian worked in his study. Each door was a tombstone for a hope she had once held. The hope for partnership, the hope for conversation, the hope for a simple, shared smile. She felt no sorrow passing them now, only a profound, quiet relief, as if shedding layers of heavy, suffocating cloth. Her footsteps made a solitary rhythm on the polished oak floors. The house was vast and unnervously still, as if holding its breath. She reached the top of the grand staircase, the heart of the manor. It swept downwards in a majestic, intimidating curve of dark, gleaming wood. How many times had she descended these stairs feeling small, her hand trembling slightly on the ornate banister, preparing herself for an evening of polite smiles and veiled insults. She remembered her wedding day, walking down these same stairs on her father's arm. Her dress had been a cloud of white silk, a Croft family heirloom. It had felt heavy then, and she knew why now. It was the weight of expectation, the weight of a life that was never meant to be her own. She placed her hand on the banister. The wood was cool and smooth beneath her palm. It felt different today, solid, real, a support for her departure, not a guide rail into her prison. She took the first step down. The sound of her leather-soled shoe on the wood echoed in the cavernous space. It was not the tentative, soft sound of the daughter-in-law trying to be invisible. It was the firm, deliberate tread of a woman leaving. With each step, a memory unspooled and dissolved. A Christmas dinner where Margaret had praised a distant cousin's accomplishments, while pointedly ignoring Eleanor. A garden party where Julian had corrected her in front of guests for mispronouncing a French diplomat's name. The endless breakfast, just like this morning's, filled with a silence so sharp it could cut glass. These moments had once been 1,000 tiny paper cuts on her soul. Now they were just scenes from a play in which she no longer had a part. The pain was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer an active wound. It was the scar tissue of a battle she had finally decided to end. She was halfway down the staircase when she saw her. Margaret Croft was standing at the bottom, perfectly positioned in the center of the black and white marble floor. She stood as if she had grown from the very foundations of the house, her posture rigid, her silver hair a flawless helmet. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her chin held high. She was not looking at Eleanor with surprise, but with a cold, simmering fury. She had been waiting. Of course she had been waiting. This was her domain, and no one left without her final decree. Eleanor did not falter. She continued her slow, steady descent, her eyes locked on her mother-in-law. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken words. This was the final confrontation. Not with Julian, the man who saw her as a convenient, ordinary object, but with Margaret, the woman who had seen her as an intruder from the very first day, the architect of her daily misery, the matriarch of this cold, gilded world. As Eleanor reached the last few steps, she could see the faint, triumphant sneer playing on Margaret's lips. It was the look of a predator who believes its prey is making a foolish, fatal mistake. Margaret let the silence stretch, letting the grandeur of the foyer press in on Eleanor. The towering ceilings, the cold marble, the imposing front door. It was all designed to make one feel insignificant. It had worked for 3 years. It did not work today. Eleanor's feet touched the marble floor. The chill of the stone did not seep through her shoes. She stopped a few feet from Margaret. Placing her suitcase quietly beside her, the two women faced each other. One was dressed in a tailored silk blouse and priceless pearls, the very image of entrenched power. The other wore a simple dress, the one she had arrived in years ago, her only accessory, the silver locket hidden beneath her collar. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice a low, venomous hiss that cut through the stillness. Running away? How predictable. You were never strong enough for this family. Her eyes swept over Eleanor's plain suitcase with disdain. Where do you think you are going with that pathetic little bag? Back to your mother's tiny house? Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched Margaret, her expression calm. This lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Margaret more than any argument could. Do you have any idea what you are throwing away? Margaret continued, taking a step closer, her voice rising slightly. This life, this name, the respect, the security. You'll be nothing without us, a nobody. You will walk out that door and you will cease to exist. You'll have no money, no influence, no name. Nothing. The words were meant to be a curse, a final crippling blow. They were meant to ignite the fear that had kept Eleanor compliant for so long. Fear of failure, fear of poverty, fear of being alone. And for a fleeting second, a tremor of that old fear did flicker inside her. The world outside these walls was uncertain. But then she thought of her mother's garden. She thought of the smell of baking bread in a warm kitchen. She thought of laughter that was not forced. She thought of a life where her worth was not measured by the name she carried or the money she had access to. She looked directly into Margaret Croft's cold, furious eyes. All the years of biting her tongue, of swallowing insults, of shrinking herself to fit into their world, it was all over, and there was no anger left. There was only a quiet, unshakable clarity. She spoke, and her voice was not the whisper they were used to. It was soft, but it filled the space between them, clear and true. No, Eleanor said, I won't be nothing. She paused, letting that single word hang in the air. She saw a flicker of confusion in Margaret's eyes. I'll be me. It was not a retort. It was a revelation. It was the simplest, most powerful truth she had ever spoken in this house. For 3 years, she had been Mrs. Julian Croft. She had been the Croft daughter-in-law. She had been an arrangement, an accessory, an ordinary, quiet problem solver. She had been everything but herself. Now she was choosing to be just that. Eleanor Vance, a woman who liked common flowers, a woman who had a loving mother, a woman with a heart that had been broken but was, miraculously, still beating. Margaret stared at her, momentarily speechless. The sneer on her face faltered, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending rage. This was not the crying, pleading, defeated girl she had expected. This was a stranger. Eleanor did not wait for a response. There was nothing more to say. She had said the only thing that mattered. She bent down and her fingers closed around the handle of her suitcase. She straightened up, turned her back on Margaret Croft, and began to walk toward the massive oak front doors. Each step was an act of liberation. The echo of her shoes on the marble was the only sound. She did not look back. She knew if she did, she would see Margaret standing there, a queen ruling over an empty kingdom of cold stone and loveless portraits. She would see Julian, perhaps, finally appearing at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of confusion and wounded pride. But their world no longer concerned her. It was a picture behind glass. She was walking out of the frame. Her focus was on the door. The heavy carved wood that had once seemed like a barrier to the world was now her gateway to it. The intricate iron handle felt cool and solid in her grasp. She turned it. The mechanism moved with a heavy oiled groan. She pulled the door open. Sunlight, brilliant and warm, streamed into the dim foyer, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a new day. She stepped across the threshold, out of the shadows of Blackwood Manor and into the light. She did not pause. She did not hesitate. Behind her, the heavy oak door swung shut. The latch clicked into place with a deep, final sound that echoed through the grand hall, a sound of absolute conclusion. It was the sound of a cage door closing on an empty space. The sound that sealed her passed away forever. The heavy oak door of Blackwood Manor clicked shut behind her. Eleanor did not look back. She walked down the long gravel driveway, her single suitcase feeling impossibly light in her hand. Months passed, winter thawed into spring, and spring had now bloomed into a warm summer. Eleanor knelt in the soft, dark earth of her mother's garden. Her hands, once used to cold crystal and polished silver, were now covered in soil. Dirt was lodged beneath her fingernails, a detail that would have sent Margaret Croft into a spiral of silent judgment. Here it felt like a badge of honor. Laughter bubbled up from her chest, mixing with the sound of her mother Helen, snipping at a rose bush. "I swear, Eleanor," Helen said, a smile in her voice, "you talk to these plants more than you talk to me." Eleanor looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "They're better listeners," she teased. A genuine warmth spread through her. This was peace. It was the quiet hum of contentment under the surface of every ordinary day. The flowers here were not like the cold, perfect arrangements at the manor. They were a chaotic, joyful riot of color, reaching for the sun. Eleanor felt she was learning to do the same. The familiar rumbling of the postman's van broke the quiet. A cheerful man named Thomas waved. "Just one for you today, Eleanor," he called out, handing her an envelope. And the quiet hum of contentment stopped. It was thick, made of heavy, expensive cream paper that felt alien in her hands. In the top left corner, embossed in severe black lettering, was the name of a London law firm. She didn't need to see the Croft family crest to know. The envelope felt like a stone dropped into the placid water of her new life. She felt her mother's gaze on her back, full of unspoken questions. For a fleeting second, the old Eleanor surfaced. The one who would have flinched, whose heart would have begun a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But her hand was steady. Her breath was even. She looked at the sharp, precise calligraphy of her name. Eleanor Vance. Not Eleanor Croft. They had respected that much, at least. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice clear. He tipped his cap and was on his way, oblivious to the ghost he had just delivered. Eleanor turned, meeting her mother's worried eyes. Helen's face was a map of love and fear, the fear that this paper could undo all the healing. "Eleanor?" Helen's voice was a soft whisper. Eleanor gave her a small, reassuring smile. It was real. "It's all right, Mom," she said. "I'm just going to take care of this." She walked into the cool shade of the cottage. The air inside smelled of baking bread and old books. In the living room, a low fire crackled in the hearth, a comforting presence her mother always kept. Eleanor stood before it. She thought of Julian's cold eyes. She thought of Margaret's triumphant smirk. What did this letter contain? Divorce papers? A settlement offer to buy her silence? Or was it a letter from Julian himself, attempting to explain or demand or control? Her mind briefly pictured the words inside. Legal jargon, clauses, or maybe, just maybe, a single handwritten line. The thought held no power. It was like wondering about the weather on a day long past. Whether he felt regret or fury, the outcome was the same. Their world and their rules no longer applied to her. Opening the letter would be an act of engagement. It would be acknowledging that what they had to say still mattered. And it didn't. With a quiet final breath, she let the thick envelope drop from her fingers. It landed softly on the glowing embers. For a second, nothing happened. Then a corner began to darken. A small tongue of flame licked at the edge, and then the fire took hold. The name of the law firm vanished into a bright orange curl. The paper, once so imposing, became a fragile piece of ash. It devoured the weight of her past, turning it into nothing but heat and light. She watched until the last corner was gone, until there was only the gentle crackle of the logs. She felt a profound sense of release. The final thread had been cut. She turned and walked back outside into the brilliant sunshine. Helen was standing by the door, her eyes shining with unshed tears of pride and relief. Eleanor walked to her and gave her a hug, burying her face for a moment in her mother's shoulder. Then she let go. She walked back to her small patch of earth and knelt down, plunging her hands back into the cool, life-giving soil. She tilted her head back, closing her eyes, and let the full warmth of the sun wash over her face. A slow, peaceful smile spread across her lips. She had found her way back to herself.